A stranger sits behind a wall you cannot see through. A man in a white lab coat stands beside you and hands you a switch. He tells you the stranger is about to answer questions. If he gets one wrong, you press the switch. The first shock is mild, 15 volts. The stranger yelps. You press it again. 30 volts. He asks you to stop. You look at the man in the lab coat. He says 4 words. Please continue the experiment. This is not fiction. This happened. To ordinary people. Thousands of them. And most of them did not stop. The year is 1961. The place is Yale University. The man in the lab coat is not testing whether you can hurt a stranger. He already knows you can. He is testing something else entirely. How far authority can push an ordinary decent person before conscience finally speaks louder than obedience. Stanley Milgram was a young psychologist at Yale. A year earlier, a former Nazi officer named Adolf Eichmann had stood trial in Jerusalem for organizing mass deportations during the Holocaust. His defense was strikingly simple. He said he was only following orders. The philosopher Hannah Arendt attended the trial expecting to see a monster. Instead, she saw something stranger, an ordinary bureaucrat, calm, unremarkable, almost bored by his own testimony. She called this the banality of evil, not born from hatred, but from an unwillingness to question authority. Milgram wanted to know something specific. Was Eichmann an aberration, or was he disturbingly closer to normal than anyone wanted to admit? So he built an experiment to find out. He recruited ordinary volunteers from New Haven, teachers, clerks, engineers, nobody unusual in any way. He told them they were testing memory and punishment. The stranger behind the wall was an actor. The shocks were fake, but the volunteers did not know that. As far as they understood, they were hurting a real human being, one increasing jolt at a time, because a man in a white coat told them the experiment required it. The shock generator in front of each volunteer had 30 switches, 15 volts to 450. The labels beside the switches climbed in plain clinical English: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, danger, severe shock. The final 2 switches had no label at all. Just 3 letters, XXX. As the voltage rose, the actor behind the wall began to protest, then scream, then, past a certain point, fall completely silent, as though unconscious or worse. Before running the experiment, Milgram asked 40 psychiatrists to predict the results. They estimated that less than 1% of people would go all the way to the final switch. Only the rarest, most disturbed individuals, they said, could do such a thing to another human being on command. They were wrong. 65% of participants delivered the maximum shock, not because they wanted to. Many sweated, trembled, laughed nervously in distress, begged the experimenter to let them stop, and then pressed the switch anyway. Milgram had a theory for what he had just witnessed. He called it the agentic state. Under ordinary circumstances, a person experiences themselves as the author of their own actions, autonomous, responsible. The moral weight of a choice sits with the one who makes it, but inside a clear hierarchy something shifts. The person stops experiencing themselves as an independent actor, and begins experiencing themselves as an instrument, a conduit, a hand carrying out someone else's will. And once that shift happens, the felt sense of personal responsibility doesn't just weaken, it transfers, not to the victim, to the authority giving the order. I was just following orders is not, Milgram argued, merely an excuse invented after the fact. For many of his participants, it was an accurate description of their internal experience in the moment. The self does not disappear. It simply stops feeling like the one holding the switch. To understand why this mechanism exists at all, you have to look past psychology and into evolution itself. For most of human history, small hierarchical groups outcompeted flat, leaderless ones. A band that instantly obeyed a skilled hunter's warning about a predator survived. A band that debated the warning first often did not. Deference to a demonstrated authority was not weakness. It was, for most of human history, one of the fastest and most reliable paths to safety. Evolution therefore built a brain that responds to legitimate seeming authority the way it responds to almost nothing else, quickly, automatically, beneath the level of conscious deliberation, a white coat, a uniform, a title, a confident, calm voice giving clear instructions. These are not arbitrary symbols. They are, to a very old part of the human brain, exactly the signals that once meant this person has proven themselves capable of keeping the group alive. Obey them, and questions can wait. The problem is not that this instinct is broken. The problem is that it cannot tell the difference between a hunter warning of a lion and a stranger in a lab coat asking you to hurt someone. Milgram did not stop at one experiment. Over the following years, he ran more than a dozen variations, changing a single detail each time to isolate exactly what made obedience rise or fall. When the experimenter left the room and gave instructions by telephone instead of standing beside the volunteer, obedience collapsed. Compliance with the maximum shock fell by more than half. Physical proximity to authority mattered enormously. When two additional actors, posing as fellow volunteers, refused to continue and walked out before the real participant's turn, obedience collapsed even further. In some versions, fewer than 1 in 10 participants still delivered the maximum shock. A single visible act of refusal was often enough to break the spell for everyone watching. This detail matters more than almost anything else in the entire body of research. Obedience was not a fixed trait, present in some people and absent in others. It was a condition, created by circumstance, sustained by isolation, and broken again and again by the simple visible example of one other person saying no. On the night of January the 27th, 1986, engineers at a NASA contractor spent hours on a conference call, arguing that the Space Shuttle Challenger should not launch the next morning. The temperature at the launch site was forecast to be dangerously cold. Their own data showed that the rubber O-ring sealing the rocket boosters became stiff and unreliable in cold weather. Data collected from a previous cold weather launch had already shown troubling damage. Management on the call pushed back. The launch had already been delayed several times. Schedules were public. Expectations were high. At one point, a senior manager reportedly told an engineer to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. The engineer's formal recommendation to postpone was overturned. The following morning, Challenger launched in freezing temperatures. 73 seconds later, it broke apart in the sky, killing all 7 people aboard. The subsequent investigation found that the technical warning had been correct in every detail. What failed was not the engineering. What failed was the willingness of people, inside a clear hierarchy under real pressure, to let a title outweigh the data in the room. This channel began with a single sentence. History repeats itself because human nature rarely changes. The temptation, hearing a story like this, is to imagine that you would have been different, that you would have refused the switch, walked off the call, said no. Milgram's own participants believed the same thing about themselves before they sat down in that chair. The uncomfortable finding of 60 years of research is not that some people are obedient and some are not. It is that the conditions of obedience can be built around almost anyone, given the right hierarchy, the right isolation, and the right authority standing close enough. But the research also found the exit. A single person refusing openly in the room was often enough to change everything, not a committee, not a policy. One visible act of dissent at the moment it mattered. The machine that makes us obey has not changed in 60,000 years. Neither has the one thing that reliably interrupts it. Someone standing close enough to be seen, willing to say the word no, before everyone else decides it is too late to say it with them.